Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to the ICA. My name is Matt Williams and I'm the curator here. And tonight we're very pleased to have Ruth Blacksell here, who is the Programme Director of the MA in Book Design and Department of Typography at the Graphic Communication at Reading University. Basically, Ruth will talk here about the relationship between conceptual art practice and typography, and we have a number of events coming up in the near future, such as Publish and Be Damned, and also I Don't Want to Make a Book. So if you're all interested in the subject matter, then please have a look at your booklets and book a ticket. Thank you very much, and Ruth, thank you.
Firstly, I just want to say thank you to Matt Williams for giving me this opportunity to talk at the ICA. I'm really pleased to be able to include in my talk some of the examples which have been in the exhibition here and feature some of them in my talk. But also because it's interesting to see the original documents out there on display and also some of the recent facsimile editions of these works and accounts of them which have been collected together in the foyer outside. I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes to an hour, and then at the end of that time there'll be an opportunity for talk, for questions and any things that people want to add. So if you could wait until the end to ask questions, that would be good. So the images I'm going to show here are all text-based artworks produced between the late 1950s and the mid-70s. These works are most often included within art historical accounts of conceptual art, although some of the earlier examples I include are usually described in these accounts as fluxus or proto-conceptual. And some of the artists I've included have also occasionally disputed the labelling of their work under the umbrella of conceptual art. The works are, however, broadly chosen because of their relevance to the evolution and the importance of text-based practices during this art historical period. These works are situated against the backdrop of a general shift from the notion of art as an object towards the notion of art as an idea, and in particular how this manifested itself through experiments with the ways in which the idea could be implemented conceptually through language rather than perceptually through vision. This shift is encapsulated by Sol LeWitt's Sentences on Conceptual Art, which were published as a series of 35 numbered points in the magazine 0 to 9 in 1969. And republished later the same year in the first issue of the journal Art Language, the Journal of Conceptual Art. And here are just 5 of the sentences which seem to have particular resonance with some of the text works I discuss. Ideas alone can be works of art. They are in a chain of development that may eventually find some form. All ideas need not be made physical. Since no form is intrinsically superior to another, the artist may use any form, from an expression of words, written or spoken, to physical reality equally. If words are used and they proceed from ideas about art, then they are art and not literature. Numbers are not mathematics. The concept of a work of art may involve the matter of the piece or the process in which it is made. Once the idea of the piece is established in the artist's mind and the final form is decided, the process is carried out blindly. There are many side effects that the artist cannot imagine. These may be used as ideas for new works. Importantly, though, LeWitt's last sentence, number 35, states, "These sentences are a comment on art, but are not art." As such, I include the sentences here as a means of positioning or contextualising the emergence of text-based conceptual artworks, rather than as an example of text-based artwork in themselves. The shift from object to idea is of course connected to the collapse of Greenberg's medium-specific modernism in the mid-1960s and the emergence of a new art-critical position which moved away from the idea of the passive spectator looking at a pre-existing artwork towards the idea of an active spectator, engaged somehow in the physical and/or conceptual creation of the work. So in the case of these text works, what was presented here via typography and the publication of printed matter was a context where the spectator could conceivably be engaged with the creation of the artwork through the active process of reading rather than any visual contemplation. This shift has been articulated as a move towards the formation of art through reading rather than the reception of art through looking, as discussed, for example, by Robert Smithson in his Language to be Looked at and/or Things to be Read press release from 1967, and Terry Atkinson of Art and Language in his essay concerning the article Dematerialisation of Art in 1968, and his introduction to the first edition of Art Language in 1969. Atkinson, for example, proposed that although arguably visual, text-based language is culturally coded as non-visual, and thus, rather being read as visual, it is read for meaning, a point reiterated by Charles Harrison in his Essays on Art and Language, through his observation that any aesthetic criteria attributed to text-based formats is usually related to how effectively the message is conveyed, rather than any conventional idea of the visual. It is also important to note that the turn to language in the art of this period also connects these text works with the philosophical shift through structuralism and semiotics, which has aligned them with much earlier experiments with writing style and typographic manipulation in literature and poetry, as for instance in Lawrence Stern's novel Tristram Shandy, which was published in the mid-18th century, and Stefan Mallarmé's poem A Throw of the Dice, which was published in the late 19th century, or in French experimental writings of the 50s from those like Michel Butor and Alain Robbe-Grillet, or through post-war American poets like Jackson McLough and John Ashbery. These earlier experiments in poetry and literature often demonstrate, alongside the style of their writing, the use of specific textual arrangements and page layout to disrupt what has subsequently been described as a readerly immersion in the text, an idea which by the late 1960s had connected to the theoretical writings of those like Roland Barthes, through, for example, his depictions of the death of the author, and later his idea of the writerly text. In fact, it is worth noting that Barthes' Death of the Author essay was first published in English in 1966 in a printed booklet within the magazine Aspen, alongside another identical booklet, which contained the first publication of a text work by the artist Dan Graham, poem, March 1966. Which through its construction, via an editor's response to questions about a document's editorial and design specification, is discussed in relation to a shift away from authorship and the autonomous artwork. It's worth also noting that although at the time of production of these works the artist made only very occasional specific reference to this theoretical territory, subsequent critical readings of conceptual art have re-evaluated the turn to language in these works through the lens of this general evolution in philosophical and aesthetic thought towards language-based theoretical models. So that whilst accepting Lewitt's 1967 statement that the philosophy of the work is implicit in the work and is not an illustration of any system of philosophy, one does inevitably make connections between these works and the coincidental theoretical engagements of structuralism, semiotics, and later post-structuralism. It is also relevant to foreground that some of the artists I discuss here most notably Vito Acconci and Dan Graham, initially considered themselves to be poets and titled some of their early works as poems. Indeed, their own accounts describe how they were, at the time, in the early to mid-60s, involved with the New York School of Poetry and were familiar with European experimental literature through their reading of journals like the Evergreen Review. As you'll see, though, some of the text works from this period are more explicitly drawn from poetry than others. What is therefore essential with regard to these works is to see how they in fact emerged out of the intersecting of a number of historical and theoretical factors, which includes this philosophical territory and the obvious historical lineage back to the nomination and staging of Duchamp's ready-mades, but also incorporates other contextual features surrounding the visual arts of that time, including, as I have mentioned, the specific breakdown of the critical discourse of medium-specific modernism, and also the particular social and economic climate at the time, in the 1960s, which itself provided new possibilities for the positioning of art within published contexts. I would include here, for example, the opportunities created through the new journalism and readership of mass circulation illustrated magazines, like Esquire and Harper's Bazaar, or the new magazine-like appearance and more expansive editorial approach of art publications such as Art Forum, or the opportunities that new office printing technologies such as Xerox or Mimeograph presented for small print-run publications. In fact, it is relevant that what these new publishing contexts helped to create was a new kind of audience for art who would be receptive, whether knowingly or not, to the positioning of works in these kinds of printed matter. As Dan Graham put it, I didn't go to art school or college, but I read a lot of magazines like Esquire. Not to be academic about it, but I think the mid-60s was magazine culture. I really liked Esquire, which had writing and also photographs by famous photographers, often about the suburbs. Although examples of conceptual art obviously encompassed a wide variety of media, the ones I'm concerned with here focus on specific interrogations of typographic or text-based language in achieving this shift from object to idea. Indeed, within their own niche, these text-based works themselves appropriate their own diverse array of typographic and publishing genre, which range from, amongst others, concrete poetry to illustrated magazine articles, advertisements, to dictionary definitions, to listed instructions, to comparative tabular arrangements, to continuous essay texts, and cross-referencing indexing systems. I'm not going to attempt to present here an exhaustive survey of every example of text art during this time, but I plan to look at some specific examples of typography and page layout, and what I think are a few of the key works of this period. My intention is to show how these works opened up a new context for the positioning of art, a context that allowed these works to further undermine traditional ideas of form, authorship, and the institution, which had dominated pre-1960s art. As such, the text works I'm looking at here are not those involving one-off painted or stenciled texts, as for example produced by those like On Kawara or Ed Ruscha, which are in some ways easier to describe and exhibit through conventional author-object-based criteria. In fact, I want to specifically focus here on those works that were typeset, printed, and distributed through the channel of mainstream print-based publishing, and as such can be identified as much with the activity of publishing as with their particular material forms of printed matter. I should say that one of the things that has struck me in my own examination of these works is the often inadequate way in which they're reproduced in retrospective critical accounts. Whilst these accounts contain detailed descriptions of the operations of these works, these are quite often accompanied by poor, sometimes incomplete or incorrectly captioned or ordered imagery. And for this reason, it's often taken me a while to figure out how exactly some of these works have evolved as pieces of conceptual art. Take, for example, the work Homes for America by Dan Graham, which is held up as one of the most seminal pieces of text-based conceptual art. The usual account of this work is that it began as a proposal for an illustrated magazine article with the content and arrangement of the text and images referring back to the serial logic of minimalist art via a descriptive reportage-style account of suburban tract housing in a New Jersey suburb. In fact, from its outset, Graham had in mind an intention to place this work within a mainstream published context by his production of a pasted-up page layout intended for submission to a magazine editor. As the story goes, he was initially thinking of a mass circulation magazine like Esquire, but possibly due to the position of his friend Robert Smithson as a contributing editor, he prepared and presented it instead to Arts magazine. At this point, the point at which it was accepted for publication, the work made its shift from a static, conventionally object-like paste-up into the active context of publishing, whereby the editors changed the layout to follow the magazine's house style and replaced some of Graham's photographs with alternative imagery. So the operation of this work as a piece of conceptual art lies in this shift, away from the autonomous art object, away from the hand of the author, away from the institution, and into the work existing within the activity of mainstream publishing via its editorial alteration and reproduction, and importantly through its subsequent reformulation in later published versions. It is, however, hard to get your head around this properly when faced with the available reproductions of Homes for America evolution, and which are usually shown as single images of either the paste-up, the initial published version, or later reconfigurations of the piece, each being equally captioned with the title Homes for America, without sufficient visual explanation of their relationship to the various stages of this potentially ongoing progression. For me, despite the undisputed quality of critical accounts of the piece by Graham himself, but also those such as Jeff Wall, David Campany, Thomas Crow, Benjamin Buchler and others, the importance of actually seeing this progression was key to my full understanding of the operation of this work. Homes for America began with Graham's Kodak Instamatic photographs of a New Jersey suburban houses and diners, which he started in the early 1960s and in 1966 projected as slides in the exhibition Projected Art at the Finch College Museum of Art in New York. However, in 1966, Graham also wrote and produced the pasted-up page layout for an illustrated magazine article, which included some of these photographs alongside a written account of the particular style of the suburban tract housing in this suburb. He submitted this to Arts magazine, where, as I said, his friend Robert Smithson was at that time a contributing editor. Arts magazine, so I put up in the corner here just to show the progression of this work. So that's the original paste up, and this is the new published piece. Arts magazine ran the piece in the critique section of their December 1966 to January 1967 issue, although they altered the page layout so that the article would run on from the previous article and into the next. The editor also dropped most of Smithson's photographs and substituted instead, most of Graham's photographs were substituted instead a photograph by the established photographer Walker Evans, whose images were popular in sociological journalism at the time. I've included this reproduction of Homes for America to demonstrate the point I want to make about the problems with reproductions of this work. Here, Thomas Crow's discussion of the initial publication of the piece is accompanied by a reproduction of the pages from Arts magazine, but these have been reordered so they appear as a double-page spread, as Graham had originally proposed for the piece with his paste-up, rather than running across consecutive pages and being clearly positioned between two other articles, a decision made by the editors of Arts magazine. So you can see that he's taken this page here and reproduced it here, and then he's taken this page here and reproduced it here. And so in effect, he's reproduced a double-page spread, as Graham had originally wanted. What Crow's reproduction fails to show then is one of the key aspects of the first transition of the piece, which shifts it away from its status as an artist-authored arrangement considered to some degree visually, and into its new status as a visually undifferentiated piece, following the predetermined house style of the magazine. And then in 1970, Graham produced another paste-up of Homes for America, which, although represented as a double-page spread, differs again in format from both his original paste-up and the Arts magazine version. Original paste-up in the corner. Can't do this. And the original published version, and this is the new paste-up here. And returns to the inclusion of Graham's original photographs. This version also often appears alongside critical accounts of Homes for America, and like the Arts magazine version, is accepted and referred to as the work. And then in 1972, a booklet was produced by Listen Gallery in London, who represent Graham, and Koenig Publishing. And here again, a new layout for the piece was published, again returning to Graham's original photographs rather than the ones produced by Arts magazine. And in 1975, down the bottom here, a booklet entitled For Publication was produced by the Otis Arts Institute in Los Angeles, with yet another published layout and set of images for the piece. And so you can see through these various examples the evolution of Homes for America, through its initial insertion into the activity of mainstream publishing and its first editorial alteration, and through its subsequent reformulations in later published versions, which were instigated both by Graham and others involved in this activity. And it seems important to demonstrate this lineage because it shows how the work Homes for America can be understood equally as any single one of these examples, or as them all collectively. And I include this last image to show how these Homes for America pages and Graham's original images can also be seen to have come full circle when they're seen exhibited as they are here, framed on gallery walls, in a return back to the conventional author-object-based form of a medium-specific artwork, which can only really serve as a misrepresentation of the piece. I'm going to move on from Homes for America now and look at the operation of another interesting published text work by Dan Graham, which I referred to earlier. Poem, March 1966, which presents another kind of formulation via its insertion into the activity of editorial publishing. As I mentioned earlier, this piece was published in 1966 alongside Bart's Death of the Author essay in the magazine Aspen, and as with Homes for America, it has been discussed in relation to a shift away from authorship and the autonomous work. The piece begins with a set of questions titled Schema, about the editorial and design specification of the poem's host publication. And an instruction from Graham that the list of questions is to be set in its final form by the editor of the publication where it is to appear. He also states that this activity should happen in various magazines to create a series or set of individual poems. And here is the final poem, or specification, the answers to the questions posed by the schema, as it appeared in the Aspen booklet in 1966. However, as with Homes for America, further reproductions of this piece are also sometimes hard to follow, since the resulting poems are often simply titled schema, with no visual reference to the connection between the schema, the set of questions, and the resulting list of specifications. Here is the work published in the journal Art Language in 1969, with the full instruction at the top, as well as both the schema here and the poem here. And here are just some of the poems as reproduced by the editors of a variety of publications between 1968 and 75, which, as I say, are often reproduced as standalone images under the title Schema, March 1966. And in another twist, Graham's initial instruction about the work includes a statement in which he draws attention to the impossibility of anyone ever being able to reconstruct this poem into the physical piece described by the specification. This Graham attributes to the fact that each of the component lines of exact data requiring completion in terms of specific numbers and percentages would be contingently determined by every other number and percentage, which itself in turn would be determined by the other numbers and percentages ad infinitum. And hence, despite presenting itself as a specification, the poem can only ever actually exist as a piece of text which refers back to its own publication. Despite many other interesting works by Graham, most notably those published in the ads sections of magazines and newspapers in the mid to late 60s, I want to, for the sake of time, leave his work now and jump across to another set of text engagements which appeared at the same time as Graham's magazine works, but although developing out of the same context and interrogating the same issues, were evolved through a variety of very different typographic means. I'm going to focus here on the artists Vito Acconci and Carl Andre, although I'll make reference to a number of others at the time who also produced examples of this type of work. Of key importance here is the magazine 0 to 9, which Acconci produced with the poet Bernadette Mayer for 2 years during the late 1960s. This magazine was started by Acconci and Mayer as an environment for their own work and for other unusual poetry and literary writings, but increasingly it included text-based artworks, until the final issues were dominated by the works of conceptual artists, including, amongst others, Sol LeWitt, Robert Smithson, Dan Graham, Adrian Piper, Robert Barry, Douglas Hubler, and Lawrence Weiner. As Acconci said in his introduction to the recent facsimile edition, Bernadette and I needed an outlet for what we did. At the same time, we wanted a context for what we did. On the one hand, the magazines by and with the New York School Poetry weren't publishing us. On the other hand, we didn't want to be in those magazines. We didn't want to be 2 more New York School poets. In fact, what is interesting about these works of Acconci and also Andre is how they serve to bridge the divide from poetry to art. As with Graham, Acconci had initially considered himself to be a poet, and accounts of his early text works and those of Andre often connect them back to post-war American poets like John Ashbery and Jackson McLough, and to others like Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound, and Samuel Beckett, whose writings were similarly focused, sometimes typographically, on procedure, process, and extreme linguistic reduction. Linguistic and/or typographic reduction, so that a text becomes anti-referential and apparently dysfunctional, was thus one of the core strategies also used by both Acconci and Andre. And in examples of their early text works, this was achieved through their particular choice of words for the text, which often referred back to the processes of typesetting and reading, or through their use of typographic devices like punctuation marks within their texts. or through their reduction to typographic arrangements of single-word nouns rather than sentences containing verbs. Indeed, André himself said, "Verbs are relational, I prefer nouns." However, as with Graham's text and images for Homes for America, some of which I've pulled out here, these reductionist strategies can be seen to derive not only from poetry, but out of the serial logic of minimalist sculpture. And so as with Homes for America, many of Acconci and André's works show text reduced and isolated into independent units through the application of classic minimalist strategies such as reduction, interruption, accumulation, fragmentation, and repetition. What the text works of André in particular demonstrate is the potential for words to operate as a form of sculptural unit, in the same vein as the units, bricks, blocks, bales, tiles, etc., that he employed for his more conventional minimalist sculptural works. His recombinations and rearrangements of basic word units is clearly an extension of his interrogation of the relationship between the part, the cut, and the overall sculptural unit. As André himself stated in relation to the link between his sculpture and his poetry, my interest in elements or particles in sculpture is paralleled by my interest in words as particles of language. I use words in units which are different from grammatical sentences. But of course, words always connect when they're placed together, if they're not nonsense words. I have attempted to write poetry in which the sentence is not the dominant form, but the word is the dominant form. Robert Smithson also talks about André's poems in his 1968 article, A Museum of Language in the Vicinity of Art, published in the magazine Art International, where he describes how each poem is a grave, so to speak, for his metaphors. Semantics are driven out of his language in order to avoid meaning. His poems and sculpture have no mental or secondary qualities. They are to him solidly material. However, Smithson goes on to emphasise that what he is interested in is the physical properties of both language and material, and he states, "I don't think they are discrete. They are both physical entities, but they have different properties. And within these properties you have these mental experiences, and it's not simply empirical facts." So whereas minimalist art by this time had come to be seen as outdated and confined by its focus on the object, the important point about these text works is that although initially also focusing on the word as a material unit, they also demonstrate a shift across into a more specifically language-centred interrogation, which meant that, as constructions of text, they subsequently had the potential to expand away entirely from the confines of the object. In other words, although at first glance some of these text works might appear to connect to concrete poetry, where the text would be arranged semi-pictorially to evoke the poem's subject, what differentiates them is precisely the ways they echoed the shifting theoretical paradigms of visual art at that time, by moving the object into an entirely language-based context. Indeed, in his account of Acconci's text works, Craig Dworkin observes how, in the early 1960s, these works began to swerve away from their literary underpinnings and identify more with the text-based engagements which had accompanied Fluxus art and experimental music of the late 1950s and early 60s. One can, for example, look at the work like 4 minutes 33 seconds by John Cage, which evolved in the 1950s from a conventional music score on the left to a graphics score in the middle, to a typewritten text on the right, so that in its final form, the operation of the work was dependent upon the conceptual activation through reading of a textual instructional statement. Importantly here, the written score must be read as a key part of the performance, so that the reader makes the correct timed pauses before moving on. As Peter Osborne describes, the musical score, when transposed into the medium of language, becomes an instruction for an event score. Then, when exhibited independently in visual art context, the instruction becomes a type of conceptual art we might call a score event or an instruction piece. as Barthes also commented on this shift when he observes how we know that today post-serial music has disrupted the role of the interpreter, who is asked to be, in a sense, the co-author. The text is a little like a score of this new kind. It solicits from the reader a practical collaboration. Mallarmé raised this question. He wanted the audience to produce the book. This is also reminiscent of the instruction paintings produced by Yoko Ono in the early 1960s, where the text was used explicitly in instructive titles such as painting to be stepped on, or painting to hammer a nail, and or displayed on cards or on single pages as short instructive points or steps, which propose to the spectator one or more actions. Or the specifications and listed instructions that often accompany George Brecht's participatory works. So what these Fluxus works show is the establishment through the reduction to text of a more mind-based conceptual engagement with the spectator, as specifically achieved by the typographic articulation of the text as a set of instructions. And when looking at the evolution of text-based works on the pages of the magazine 0 to 9, particularly those of Acconci, but also examples produced by artists like Robert Barry and Douglas Hubler, one can see the same kind of shift as the text works evolved from something material and static to something increasingly dynamic. What these works achieved then was an interplay between reading and the navigation around the self-enclosed pages of the magazine. As Acconci himself stated, my involvement with poetry was with movement on a page, the page as a field for action. I can consider my use of the page as a model space, a performance area in miniature. We were poets, but a poem was already too much like a painting. Most poems could be seen at a glance on a single page. We wanted to move from number to number, from word to word, from line to line, from page to page. So to illustrate this work by Acconci, published in 0 to 9 in 1969, breaks the text into 350 single lines, which are then separated across each of the 350 individual copies of this issue of the magazine. And in this way, the work exists only as a fragment in each copy, and each of these copies becomes, in effect, unique from the rest of the print run. So in this copy of the magazine, a single line of text is set on the left-hand page, and it is uniquely numbered by a caption on the right-hand page. The line you have read is the 204th of a 350-line piece. The rest appears in the other 349 copies of 0 to 9, number 5. And in this copy, another single line of the text is set on the left-hand page, and on the right-hand page, the caption states, the line you have read is the 208th of a 350-line piece, and so on. Discussion of Acconci's text works often therefore centres around their temporality, in the sense that these works demonstrate a disconnection from what is perceived as the traditional or linear temporal mode towards something more cosmic or shifting. In the works published in 0 to 9, for example, Acconci's texts become increasingly non-linear in their arrangement on the page and intentionally disruptive to the linear reading of other surrounding texts. In this example, the poem On, which Acconci contributed to 0 to 9 in 1968, his text is set across a number of pages inserted between the texts of other contributors. This piece is created by cloning individual words from the text that immediately precede and follow it, and arranging the cloned words in a scattered single column to establish a relationship or transaction between the texts on either side. So it's not very good. But this is one contribution, this is another, and this is the poem. And so he's taken the word some from here, and then he's taken the word in from here, and then he's taken the word until from here, and so on. And the poem creates itself down the middle here. Acconci's text therefore appears to spill into or to graft and relocate text by other authors, a process described by Liz Cox as word transfer or writing through project, or by Acconci himself as a transference installation. And similarly, his moving pieces move the final word of a text by another contributor. For example, the word art, taken from the text Sentences on Conceptual Art by Sol LeWitt, and reproduced it at the bottom of the contributor's final page as a typed caption, moving art, followed by Acconci's initials, BHA. This was elaborated further with works that transferred text from other documents, as for example with Acconci's self-published bookwork, Transference Roget's Thesaurus, in 1969, which comprised columns of isolated text characters that had been transferred from the pages of an original copy of Roget's Thesaurus, with a caption to record the original and subsequent page locations. This interest in the page as a space or a site was, however, not solely the domain of Acconci, and some of the other artists contributing to 0 to 9 also explored this idea and extended it even further into an even more conceptually focused territory. This image shows a work by the artist Robert Barry, which exists solely as 2 entries on the magazine's contents page. The space between pages 29 and 30, and the space between pages 74 and 75. Gwen Allen's account of this work refers to Barry's own description of the piece in his proposal to Acconci, which states that the first is the space between any 2 facing pages, between 2 separate pieces. No page is printed, no page is left blank. I do not have a page. I have the space between 2 pages. The other idea is similar, but the space is between 2 pages on opposite sides of one sheet, e.g. the space between this page that I am writing to you on and the opposite side of this page. So as discussed by Alan and Anne Rorimer, despite on their contents page listing, these 2 works at first seem to be conceptually identical, with the same mentally delineated space, the space between referred to is actually very different for each. In the first, the space between depends upon whether or not the spread is partially or fully open, and fluctuates, eventually disappearing completely as the pages are turned. Whereas in the second, the space between refers to the minute thickness of a single page edge. Similarly, a work by Douglas Hubler in the same issue of 0 to 9 presents a single sentence positioned at the base of an otherwise blank page, and here the wording of the text serves to connect the page to the wider 3-dimensional space surrounding the magazine. It reads as follows: the point represented above draws to itself and fixes for an instant each and every other point located within the physical space of this room, and continues to do so for the entire time that this page is open, but it immediately ceases to exist when the page is turned. By using text to connect to the 2-dimensional space of the magazine, to connect the 2-dimensional space of the magazine page to the 3-dimensional space of the place where the magazine is opened, Hubler uses this work to set up an infinitely variable, interactive and contingent relationship between the text, the page and the surrounding location, which provides further grounds from which to extend to the conceptual relationship between the work and the reader. And increasingly, Acconci's text works in 0 to 9 also move in this direction, as he discusses in his Movement Over a Page essay, or his Notes on Performing a Space, both published in the magazine Avalanche in the early 70s. In fact, he describes himself how he used the page as the start of an event that keeps going off the page, used the page to fix the boundary of an event or a series of events that take place in some outside space. So for Acconci, one of the most significant things about these text works is the way they document his trajectory from poet to performance artist. And as Alan goes on to observe, the magazine did not merely record this evolution, but participated profoundly in it, serving as a bridge that allowed language to cross over from the 2-dimensional space of the page into the 3-dimensional realm of human actions and events. I want to move away from the magazine 0 to 9 now and look at some other text works which use the active participation of the spectator to complete the work. However, with these next examples, I want to look at how this involved a text-based account which, rather than a list of instructions, would need to be read as a statement in order for the work to be realised. The works of Lawrence Weiner are key to demonstrating this evolution, in that they differ quite specifically from Fluxus event scores and instruction pieces, or from the use of fabrication instructions in minimalist art. And this is particularly rooted in the way in which they involve the reader not by instruction, but by this use of the statement. In fact, Weiner even stated himself that he saw instructional text as authoritarian. As he said, to use the imperative would be for me fascistic, the tone of command as the tone of tyranny. Because of this, Weiner used the statement not in the sense of a proposition, but in the sense of a factual account of the way things stand, given in a direct, prosaic manner, operating in the same way as, for example, a bank statement. This image shows some of Weiner's statements as reproduced in the journal Art Language in 1969. And what is evident is that his texts, which he divided here into general statements and specific statements, are usually presented as isolated sentences or paragraphs, rather than sequential step-by-step configurations. And they use a linguistically passive voice, which leave their exact spatio-temporal specification indeterminate. In fact, the isolation of these statements is perhaps better illustrated by the use of individual pages in his earlier statements book. I'll go back to the previous one because you can read it better. Through these statements, Weiner was interested in the idea of language as a kind of sculptural material. But unlike André, who used the words themselves as material units, Weiner's texts gain their sculptural qualities through the translation of material form into the mind of the spectator via the act of reading, rather than from any particular form of words on the page. As Osborne put it, the pieces that Weiner states are linguistically determinate. There is no question of their having existence as idea until they are formulated as statements, and no question of them being pieces until these formulations are actualized in some system of communication, in this case, writing. And since Weiner didn't care if the processes described in these statements were executed by himself, by someone else, or not at all, as encapsulated by his famous statement of intent, these works were open to a constant activity of reinterpretation, and because of the manner in which they could remain typographically embedded in language, were not necessarily ever subject to any specific mode of construction. The images I've shown here of Weiner's text works are taken from examples that specifically appeared as typeset text in printed books. However, his statements have just as often appeared as painted or stenciled text on walls, both inside and outside the gallery. The reason why I'm focusing my discussion here on his published book texts and these examples which are so specifically neutral in their typographic style is partly just to connect them to the other examples I've looked at, which were able through this form to enter and then disappear into the context of publishing. But I also use them because they usefully lead to the idea of text as ready-made. For example, the particular format and design of Weiner's statement book was described by Weiner himself as having been deliberately designed to look like a $1.95 book that you would buy, which connects it to the specification for typewritten as opposed to calligraphic text by Cage for his 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which, as Kotz observes, moved this work away from the fetishization of the hand-drawn mark, as used for his earlier water music, towards a vernacular sign so repeatable and translatable that no original appears to exist. Or to the similar request by Yoko Ono that her instructions for paintings were typewritten, although, as Osborne observes, Ono was unable to get access to a typewriter with Japanese characters, so had to settle for them being professionally copied in a way which countered the usual decorative tradition of calligraphic display. And this is also picked up by the neutrally typographic appearance of the instruction and think pieces in her 1964 book Grapefruit. The appearance of these examples, in a similar way to Dan Graham's appropriation of magazine advertising and editorial pages, therefore aligns them with the extended ready-made analogy proposed by Graham when discussing his own published magazine works in relation to the fluorescent light works of Dan Flavin, so that through their neutral and ubiquitous operation as text, and the potential this allowed them to possess a dual or oscillating status as both non-art and art, existing simultaneously both within and outside the institution, these works could be described as a further elaboration of this extended idea of the ready-made. In fact, Joseph Kosuth took this a step further with the Xerox dictionary text used for his investigations of art as an analytical proposition, whereas Rorimer observes, the works operate by virtue of the capacity of typographic language to be what it is and what it is about simultaneously. Here, both the text and the typographic form were appropriated entirely from elsewhere, and in a further attempt for the works to operate as concepts or ideas alone, his proto-investigations were accompanied by an instruction that the Xeroxes should be thrown away and then remade each time the work was exhibited. However, the further interesting shift through Kosuth's use of text came when his investigation dispensed with these Xerox dictionary definitions and moved instead towards the publishing of definitions of possible art information directly into non-art channels of communication. This got around any potential for the works to fall into any kind of pictorial illusionism, but more importantly, it allowed him to shift his focus entirely towards the staging of art as pure information. His final investigations, therefore, moved towards the idea of art existing more as a kind of dynamic, theoretical and critical commentary, which might involve the navigation through or the originating of a series of extended and typographically undifferentiated continuous texts. In his information room, for example, sheets of printed continuous text on a multidisciplinary range of subjects were exhibited on reading tables in an environment which was described as an exhibition space containing knowledge rather than objects, and where the work, although materially contained within the room of the exhibition, was through its very textual form able to take the reader beyond the physical confines of the space. This use of text to position art within the intellectual space of theoretical and critical commentary was most fully elaborated, however, by the group Art and Language in the late 60s and early 70s, who used their practice to consider whether theoretical analysis itself could constitute a method of making art. In fact, although using a number of overlapping contexts for their inquiry, including conversations within the group and active involvements within art education, their use of typographic language was a key aspect of this process. Of particular importance were their explorations of the editorial essay as artwork, through their production of typeset continuous texts, situated within the bound format of this published journal. Here, the neutral typographic approach echoes again attempts made by others to divest their text works of any authorial artistic voice, so that the reader engages with these texts through a process of reading without any question that they should perhaps be looking at the journal as a visual object. However, in the introduction to this first issue, the group advanced a new hypothesis, which elaborates more specifically on a particular need for this completely neutral typographic appearance, that the content of the editorial is itself held out as a conceptual artwork, as constituted through its critical or theoretical content alone. I'll read a bit of this excerpt from the introduction, although the full essay elaborates much more than I can here. Suppose an artist exhibits an essay in an art exhibition, like a print might be exhibited. The pages are simply laid out flat in reading order behind the glass within a frame. The spectator is intended to read the essay straight, like a notice might be read. But because the essay is mounted in an art ambience, it is implied that the object, paper with print upon it carries conventional visual art content. The spectator, being puzzled at not really being able to grasp any direct visual art readout meaning, starts to read it as a notice might be read. It goes as follows. On why this is an essay. The appearance of this essay is unimportant in any strong sense of visual art appearance criteria. The prime requirement in regard of this essay's appearance is that it is reasonably legible. Any decisions apart from this have been taken with a view to what it should not look like as a point of emphasis over what it should look like. These secondary decisions aimed at eliminating as many appearance similarities to the established art objects as possible. So another thing discussed and elaborated on by this essay artwork was the lack of any defined exhibition instruction. In fact, it is stated that the art gallery component had to be specified by the editorial as a theoretical rather than a concrete component. However, by using its printed pages as part of their subsequent work, Index 01, the group did go on to reposition the contents of their journal back into a more conventional exhibition environment, where they were able to undertake further, more controlled interrogations of the operations of the content of these texts. Here, the unbound printed journal pages and other texts by the group were contained within the drawers of 8 metal filing cabinets, and a cross-referencing reading strategy was then suggested by assigning each text an index number and displaying a proposed system of connections along with its results in the form of printed index lists on the walls of the exhibition space. What this exhibit conveyed was how, by using this controlled exhibition context to force a particular kind of reading strategy, the content of these individual journal texts could be extended in any number of ways through their endless potential for cross-referencing to other similar texts. Indeed, this was used to demonstrate how the kinds of decisions we make about the relations between one text and another can have implications for our picture of how one might conceive of an entire conversational or ideological world. So I'm going to end this talk with the layouts of 2 published articles by Robert Smithson, which seem to fit somewhere around the point I've reached here, but also through their existence as magazine articles and through the and which was also published in 1966 in the magazine Art Voices. With Smithson's published magazine works, it's interesting that they sometimes follow the house style of the magazine, as here with his articles Entropy and the New Monuments, published in Art Forum at the top, and A Museum of Language in the Vicinity of Art, published in Art International at the bottom. And other times they were clearly designed by Smithson so that the layouts work as a constituent part of the piece, as here with Ultra Moderne at the top, published in Arts Magazine, and Strata, a geophotographic fiction, at the bottom, published in Aspen. This, it seems, often depended on his direct editorial position on the magazine or his personal contact with other contributing editors, such as this issue of Aspen, where Dan Graham was acting as guest editor. So with both quasi-infinities in the domain of the Great Bear, Smithson clearly had the opportunity to dictate the layouts, and he used this as a key component of the piece by breaking the text into separate blocks and surrounding these with textual and visual marginalia which integrate with and embellish the main body of the document to facilitate a cross-referencing style of reading. In her book Chronophobia, Pamela Lee describes this use of page layout in relation to Smithson's interest in a constellation of meaning, and she points to the inclusion in Smithson's marginalia of references to the writing of the anthropologist and architectural historian George Kubler and the cyberneticist Norbert Wiener, whose preoccupations included non-linear and metaphorical representations of past historical time and future communication systems. So despite there being no obvious connection between the arrangements of Smithson's articles and the visually undifferentiated essay-like texts of Art and Language, Smithson's use of both subject matter and layout here seems rooted in a similar territory to that of the infinite possibilities for cross-referencing content as presented by art and language in their work Index 0 to 1. As such, I'm going to go back to this image of Index 0 to 1 and a reference to a text from 1970 by Art and Language's Ian Byrne and Mel Ramsden, which seems to present an end point to this talk and perhaps a starting point for thinking about subsequent post-conceptual engagements, which has seen a shift from the distribution of text-based artworks through print towards practices which have moved on into the situation of works within the even more interactive and networked channels of digital publishing. Since an art object might by now conceivably be anything on the face of this planet, then it would be dumb to insist on nominating an analytic art construct, i.e. this paper, as an artwork. Conceptual artists had turned instead to the semiotic mosaic from which art's meaning was derived. This was the new question. How could this continuum, the system, the structure as a whole, itself be made the content of the work? Thank you.